Hello and welcome to News at 1, the main news from Britain and around the world. The headlines this Thursday morning. Iraq invades Kuwait and overthrows its government. United Nations holds emergency meeting to...
In the early morning of August 2nd, 1990, tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers, aircraft, and armored vehicles from Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist Iraqi Republic poured into neighboring Kuwait. Baathism, a form of socialist pan-Arab nationalism, was popular in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East. Many in the Arab world hoped that it would drag the region out of the colonial mess left behind by European empires. Saddam Hussein, a devout Ba'athist, had ruled Iraq with an iron fist since 1979.
طبعا شلون نتصرف ويا الخونة بالنوايا. انتم تعرفون شنو اجراءنا ويا هيك خوانة. لا شيء غير السيف.
He was known for his brutal implementation of this ideology through an aggressive foreign and internal policy. Between 1980 and 1988, Iraq was entangled in a war with Iran, which killed hundreds of thousands and sunk Iraq into a severe depression. Hussein sought salvation in Kuwait's lucrative oil fields. Impoverished as the nation was, it had a battle-hardened million-man military at its disposal. The military had the backing of Hussein's regime, which relied on its strong image and refusal to back down from confrontation. It enforced its new rule with imprisonment, torture, and executions of dissidents. The international reaction to the invasion of Kuwait was frenzied and immediate. It surprised many in the Western world, which had been otherwise occupied with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The United Nations, which had long been dogged by Soviet interference, saw an opportunity to assert itself in the new international order.
UN ambassadors were woken in the small hours, called into emergency session to face a crisis of precisely the kind this body is designed for.
This is a kind of a test for the Council and the responsibility of this Council vis-à-vis peace and security in this vital area of the world. Kuwait's request is very simple and clear, is to stop this invasion at once.
It quickly passed resolutions condemning the invasion of Kuwait and restricted almost all trade with Iraq. The country's narrow coastline sat at the far end of the Persian Gulf, a saltwater sea that reached from the Indian Ocean into the heart of the Middle East. Two ancient rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, merged into the Shatt al-Arab waterway near the coast. This waterway housed all of Iraq's important ports, and therefore most of its economic access to the world. Because the lucrative oil trade flowed through the Persian Gulf, the UN authorized the use of naval force to ensure compliance with their new restrictions. It would plug the Persian Gulf like a cork. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, which shared its long northern land border with Iraq, worried for its own security. It was wealthy too, and had oil reserves Hussein might want. It asked that British and American forces be deployed in its northern desert to help prevent any potential Iraqi invasion. Troops from 42 nations across the world slowly joined the American-led coalition massing around the Gulf. They couldn't risk Iraq invading another one of its neighbors.
There was no expectation that they would in fact attack.
This is Canadian infantry officer Jean Moret. Jean was deployed to the Gulf as the Canadian military's official historian.
They thought that it was just, positioning themselves for the public opinion because Iraq was always debating that they were entitled to have access to the oil that was being drained out of Kuwait.
At the time, Canada was looking to reinvent its military as a peacekeeping force in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. And so, it was one of the first nations to commit to this UN effort. Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was willing to offer Canada's support, but still needed to answer one important question. How much was Canada willing to give?
There was consideration of sending a brigade to be joined to the land forces of the coalition.
But Mulroney wasn't keen on sending land forces. After all, high-level planners from across the Western world calculated that a war with Iraq would be costly, leaving tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians from both sides, wounded or killed.
Mr. Mulroney knew that if there were to be large casualties, he expected that it would probably be, with the army.
From Knockabout Media, this is Rocket War, a new series looking at Canada's involvement in the First Gulf War. It's been 35 years since the close of the conflict. Over the next several weeks, you'll hear from Canadians who served as part of the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Canadian Army. These men and women were sent to a war in a country they did not know to protect people they had never met. This is episode 1, In for a Penny.
There was consideration of sending a brigade to be joined to the land forces of the coalition.
This again is Jean Morin. Jean served as the Canadian military's official historian and eventually co-authored Operation Friction, the official account of the Canadian Armed Forces' participation in the Persian Gulf. Jean recalls those heady days when decision-makers were struggling to come up with a response to the invasion of Kuwait.
But a brigade is about 5,000 personnel, but it has a tremendous amount of equipment and it takes a lot of shipping. They didn't have transportation to take that brigade there.
Even had the government been willing and able to send the Canadian Army, there was a developing conflict at home that held far greater national importance. The Oka Crisis. This standoff, which occurred between July and September 1990, was a land conflict between the federal and provincial governments in the Ganyan-Kahaga, the Mohawk, of Ganasatake, Akwesasne, and Ganawage. The confrontation was sparked over a plan by the Club de Gulf Oka to expand their course by 9 holes and build condominiums on an existing burial ground, a burial ground that had been in use for 100 years. Several attempts by the Mohawk to protect their land through the legal system had failed. With little further recourse, they dug in and armed themselves.
They had built themselves some fighting positions, and there was a great danger of violence. During the month of July of 1990, the Canadian Armed Forces were very focused on that.
But then on the 10th of August, Prime Minister Mulroney announced Canada's first contribution to the coalition headed to the Persian Gulf.
The government of the United States of America has initiated a multinational military effort to deter Iraqi aggression. The government of Canada has decided, therefore, to dispatch 3 ships of the Canadian forces to the Persian Gulf. The destroyers HMCS Athabaskan and Terra Nova and the supply ship Protecteur, with a total complement of 800 crew members, will join with naval vessels from Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, Australia, France, the United States, and other countries already operating in or destined for that region.
Canada could support the UN's objectives while still dealing with the mounting tensions at home, and without the risk of casualties that would come if coalition and Iraqi forces became locked in combat in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Following the announcement, crews trained in Halifax, while the HMCS Athabaskan, Terra Nova, and Protector each underwent much-needed updates to their weapon systems, communications equipment, and threat detection systems. Likewise, the Sea King helicopters that would accompany the ships would also have to undergo some upgrades.
I was up in CFB Borden at the time when all of this was going on, and I was camping up there because my wife was instructing. She was phototech in the military at the time.
This is Master Corporal Harold Davis. Harold was a Royal Canadian Air Force air weapons technician. Word soon came down that he was needed in Halifax.
And I said to her, I'm leaving tomorrow morning. They're sending ships to the Gulf. And I said, our ship, the Athabaskan, is the ready ship. So I said, I'm not waiting around for them to call me. I'm heading out. So I drove from Borden straight back to Shearwater.
A 1,000-kilometer trek.
And then it started. Lead-up time was 2 weeks. That we had to prep an aircraft that was not ready for anything that we were going to do in the Gulf. We had to pull out all the sonar stuff. We had to rig it with a door gun, which we had to design our own mount for. We had to come up with these stops so that the observers didn't blow the sponson off the aircraft right when they were firing it.
Crews worked in 12-hour shifts for the entire 2 weeks. so that the ships and aircraft could be ready in time. Then, on August 24, 1990, the city of Halifax came out to see the ships off.
I remember being on the back of the ship just before we tied it and talking to the guys, and we all were thinking it, but we weren't saying it. Because I'll tell you right now, we were scared shitless.
Davis recalls that everybody was pretty much on the same page.
We just heard Iraq was over there. We at the time had, the third or fourth largest army in the friggin' world, and we were going to go over and have a talk.
I had just had my wisdom teeth removed, and I remember laying on the couch at my parents' house in misery with my cheeks swollen like a chipmunk and watching the ships head on to their deployment.
This is Natasha Moore.
And all I remember thinking is, God, please bring them home.
She was a Halifax resident at the time and remembers that crowd of well-wishers waving flags from the Halifax Harbour Bridge as the three ships departed.
There were several hundreds of people, and it was just amazing. It was an amazing sight to witness. And I remember thinking, all these poor wives are going to be home, worrying about their spouses. A few men, of course, would be home as their wives were being deployed, and all these little children worrying, is mommy going to come back? Is daddy going to come back? Those were the thoughts going through not only my head, but through so many others. It was almost surreal, and I'll never forget that.
The ships, dubbed the Canadian Task Group, made the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean from Halifax to Gibraltar, then along the Suez Canal to Djibouti, and into the Gulf of Oman. All the while, the crew trained for whatever challenges were waiting ahead. By the time they reached the Strait of Hormuz, located at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the time for training was over. On September 27th, they finally docked in the Kingdom of Bahrain, one of the hubs for the coalition buildup. After a brief period of readying themselves in port, they began boarding oil tankers and trade ships as part of a multinational interception force. The MIF was composed of approximately 30 coalition ships ranging in size from small fast frigates to massive aircraft carriers loaded up with equipment and personnel. Coalition ships of all types would be tasked with intercepting suspicious tankers and merchant vessels entering the Persian Gulf. Their job? Enforce the UN embargo. And the three Canadian ships would come to play an outstanding role in this.
It was funny because the Americans, they would not put out a boarding party unless it was U.S. Marines. When a ship was around that needed to be done, they called us. If that ship, the American ship that was tracing the ship, didn't have Marines on board, they'd call us. So we send out all of our cooks and admin clerks to do it. So don't get me wrong, it sounds a little funny, but those admin clerks and medics and all of those trades that went out there, they knew what they were doing.
Between the 1st of October 1990 and mid-January 1991, the three Canadian ships conducted 1,644 interceptions, over 1/4 of all interceptions conducted by the MIF. The Royal Canadian Navy's flexibility was greatly valued by the coalition. The Athabascan, Terra Nova, and Protector earned stellar reputations.
We may have had 3 ships, but the amount of work those 3 ships did, you would have thought we had a whole fleet over there.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun.
Nobody's got it.
CNN has been told that
CNN has become a primary source of
listening to the CNN reporters who are watching it.
Oh, Jacob, CNN report Baghdad. John Holloman will be here if you need us.
I watch CNN. That's the world's intelligence service.
The unique role CNN is playing.
Watching CNN mesmerized.
The best reporting that I've seen on what transpired in Baghdad was on CNN.
Now, more than ever, stay with CNN, the world's news leader.
The conflict in the Persian Gulf marked a turning point in war reporting, introducing real-time 24-hour news coverage. For the first time in history, thanks to satellite technology and networks like CNN, television viewers could watch live footage of combat operations as they unfolded. This immediacy not only shaped public understanding of the conflict, influenced political discourse, and set a precedent for the live, continuous news cycle that defines modern conflicts today, But it also allowed a way for some wistful service personnel to connect with home.
The media were pretty good about bringing instant pictures of what was happening in the Gulf back home.
This is Vice Admiral Duncan Dusty Miller. At the time, he was a naval captain. It was the end of October, and Halloween was just around the corner.
So this sailor says, wow, it'd be nice to have a pumpkin out here.
Sergeant Claude Saint-Onge, a crewman on a Royal Canadian Air Force cargo plane, recalls that he was leaving on his first resupply flight to the Gulf.
We were going to go to Germany first as a main base, but we were diverted at the last minute to Halifax.
Claude didn't know the reason for their last-minute redirect. He only knew that they had to pick up a very important package. Claude was a loadmaster, a member of the aircrew trained to ensure that the cargo on board his C-130 Hercules was shipped safely and efficiently.
We wondered why. It was supposed to be a very important package to pick up. And there it was when I arrived. It was a 400-pound pumpkin.
He was a professional, and he'd been given a job to do.
Believe it or not.
Claude would escort the pumpkin all the way to Bahrain, where it was then transferred to a Sea King helicopter.
And the air officer came up to me from Protector and he said, you know, sir, what we should do is we should fly this pumpkin around the ships in the Gulf on Halloween, you know.
This again is Admiral Miller.
The cooks actually carved out 2 maple leaves for the eyes and Canada in the mouth, and they lit it all up with flashlights.
And then at dusk, the Sea King, with that massive pumpkin aboard, flew around to all of the coalition ships.
The UK, the US, the Allied ships, they just thought this was unbelievable. I got more messages back from all of them saying, oh, you Canadians, you were crazy in the First World War, you're crazy in the Second World War, you're still crazy. Don't ever change.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with United Nations Resolution 678, and the key words in it are, by all necessary means. Today at the United Nations, after a long and concentrated effort, the Bush administration got the backing of the UN Security Council to use force against Iraq if the president decides that's what it'll take to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait.
On November 29, 1990, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 678. This resolution gave Saddam Hussein a deadline. If his Iraqi forces didn't evacuate Kuwait by the 15th of January, the coalition was authorized to use deadly force in removing them. The Iraqi army spent the next month and a half digging fortifications along the Saudi border in anticipation of an incoming ground offensive. Hussein would not give up Kuwait without a fight. As midnight came and went on January 15th, Iraqi forces readied themselves. Late into the evening on the 16th, coalition bombers, fighter jets, and helicopters roared to life, and in the early morning hours of the following day, the first bombs were dropped.
Baghdad's lights were still blazing when the strike planes from Desert Storm found their first targets. It was a crystal clear night, making the pilot's task a little easier. The illuminated sky was filled with a star-spangled display of lethal force.
In the lead up to this day, the Iraqis had feared triggering a coalition response if they were to target the ships of the MIF. But the start of open violence changed all that. Despite the work that had been done on the 3 Canadian ships prior to departing Halifax, they did not have the air defense weapons needed to operate in frontline roles. But what they did have was the communications equipment necessary to speak to all of the coalition ships in the Gulf. So it was decided that the Canadians would coordinate and escort supply ships traveling toward frontline ships as leaders of the Combat Logistics Force.
And that's what the task group staff organized, told what each ship, where to go, and for how long, and what to do, and arranged when to get it refueled and put a schedule out.
This again is Vice Admiral Dusty Miller, who at the time was a naval captain. The Combat Logistics Force was under his command.
And then we had to know what air traffic was going to happen. And if any airplane was not flying in the right place at the right time, they were under a weapon system that would be looking at them, that could fire any second.
By mid-February 1991, Iraqi anti-ship weaponry like missiles and planes had been largely destroyed by coalition bombardment. The convoys no longer required the protection of the Combat Logistics Force. So Miller and the Canadian ships were given new tasks. The Athabascan would support U.S. Marine landings around the Gulf. The Protector would refuel and resupply coalition ships at checkpoints along maritime routes, and the Terra Nova would help protect the aircraft carriers.
The Princeton is based at Long Beach, and of course relatives of crew members gathered at the Long Beach Naval Yard today. That's where our Sylvia Lopez is standing by live. What have they heard, Sylvia?
Well, not much, unfortunately, from this end. In fact, most of the information is coming out of the command center. The ship behind us, though, is the sister ship. It's the Antietam, the sister ship of the USS Princeton. So you can see that the ties here, the USS Princeton's ties to Long Beach, are many. There are several people here, friends and families of those aboard the USS Princeton. They were crushed when they heard about the news today, and they say their hearts are in the Gulf.
On February 17, 1991, the USS Princeton, an American missile ship, was floating in the Gulf waters when it received a warning. There were Iraqi anti-ship missiles being activated on the Kuwaiti coast, and it was their job to protect the small British-American minesweeping force should any missiles fly too close. A tense night passed as the crew received notification that incoming missiles were imminent. The Princeton received another warning. The USS Tripoli, a nearby ship, had just hit a mine. As the captain announced this fact over the intercom, the crew was tossed by the force of 2 mines exploding next to their ship. Some sailors were thrown into the air. The crew then rushed to their action stations as the ship pitched up and down and side to side in 6-foot waves. Some of the sailors would later require air evacuation. Even more worrying for the remaining crew was the state of the ship herself. She'd lost a propeller, nearly immobilizing them, and the stern had started to break off. If help didn't reach them soon, the ship might sink.
The U.S. Admiral called me up and said, we've got one of our ships has been hit by a mine off Kuwait City.
They needed a ship with an anti-mine sonar system to help them out,
which Athabaskan had, and it had 2 helicopters that we could fly around. And we said, yeah, we're trained, we'll do it.
The Athabaskan and its crew prepared to enter the minefield.
So for, I would say, 72 hours there, you could hear a pin drop. The whole ship was shut down into compartments.
In battle, a ship shuts down into water and airtight compartments to protect herself and her crew.
So that if we did hit a mine, the damage would be as minimized as possible.
The dangers of hitting a mine were not small. As on the Princeton, a mine blast could throw a human like a rag doll into the ship's hard metal interior. It could also blow a hole in the side of the ship. A particularly bad blast might sink the ship in minutes, giving wounded sailors little opportunity to escape. But the Canadians, like the Americans, were consummate professionals. They were trained to deal with such dangers.
Then the boys went over and they actually landed on the back of the deck with a lot of collective, so it was like bouncing up and down, and offloaded enough beer for everybody on the ship to have 1 beer.
The crew of the Athabaskan knew how important morale boosts were in hard times. Preserving morale was crucial to keeping the ship functioning. Without that, the distracted crew could make mistakes and stumble into yet more mines.
They figured they deserved the beer after all of this, right? So, and then the ocean-going tug hooked on, and we escorted her back out of the field.
We got them safely out, back through the minefield, and then back we went on station.
The day was saved, but the war was far from over. Next time on Rocket War.
I remember the pilot telling me, Claude, light up one up because we're losing pressurization. So you got to find where we're losing pressurization. So I would smoke a cigar, look around, see where the smoke would go.
Rocket War is an original production of Knockabout Media, written by William Patterson and hosted and produced by me, Ryan Barnett. This podcast was made possible thanks to funding from Veterans Affairs Canada's Commemorative Partnership Program. It features original interviews with Tim Courtney, Harold Davis, David Deere, Chris Linford, Donald McPherson, Dr. Sean Maloney, Natasha Moore, Paul Molnar, Jean Morin, Claude Saint-Onge, and the Honorable Rebecca Patterson. Voice direction by Sonia Jamidi. Our series consultant is Jean Morin. If you enjoy this podcast, please rate and review as it helps people find the show. If you're an educator and want to incorporate this series into your classroom, we have a list of discussion questions that can be found in the show notes or downloaded from our website at knockaboutmedia.com. There you'll also find our other shows, which include Among Equals, The Black Hum, Story Girl, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood North. Thanks for listening.
A Knock About the Media original. Hold on.